What is crack-a-lackin', fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Favalli, joined by my fabulous, certified fantabulous co-host, Mr. Grant Hughes, and we're both super pleased and excited to be joined by Brian Toporek, co-host of the NBA podcast. He is also a multi-platform editor extraordinaire for Bleacher Report. He also writes for Liberty Ballers and for Forbes, covers the entire NBA at large with a special emphasis on the Philadelphia 76ers. And guess what? It's the Philadelphia 76ers 2023-2024 NBA look ahead. So, of course, he is back. I think this is year 4 or 5 of Brian doing it. So kudos to you for continuing to come back. There's obviously nothing to talk about with regards to this team. So we should be out of here in like 15 or 20 minutes. Before we get started, Brian, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me back. I'm excited to talk about the Oklahoma City Thunder tonight and only the Oklahoma City Thunder.
You did mention to Grant and I, just kind of casually before we started, that you watched all 2 hours of Sam Presti's press conference. And I want to know, for anyone who wasn't on site, I want to know how many people actually watched that. That's Pico shit. So
Yeah.
your pivot into Thunder bloggerdom, it's legitimate, huh?
I'm doing at least one a month. That's my goal.
Feels like a cry for help.
It's a cry for process help. I just want
Yeah.
to see the process fulfilled, and the Thunder the closest we're ever going to get to it.
Grant, because we all care, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to have Brian on for a number of reasons. I mean, we are coworkers that don't see each other's faces almost ever. You and I do, Dan, but also, like, I know we're going to make jokes about how the Sixers are like a tough conversation or a tough topic of conversation, but I'm super interested, and I really am excited to get Brian's perspective because I feel like he knows 1,000 times more about the Sixers than you or I do, and also, like, unfair, Brian, to say has the greater emotional investment. As like, do you admit to your fandom like I do with the Warriors and don't pretend to it or to ignore it, or like, we're gonna get the real perspective is what I'm saying here.
Yes, begrudgingly, I still regrettably care about this team.
Perfect.
Can they still hurt you though? Like,
Yeah.
is it at a point where you're made of Teflon?
I think so, because now people are like trying to taunt me with like, oh, Joel Embiid's going to request a trade, and I'm like, I've written about it for 5 months now. I'm well aware. like, you can't I think the Ben Simmons thing, that was it. Like, they just broke me by that point, and then all of this is just funny.
We will get to matters of actual basketball stuff happening on the court, the Nick Nurse hire, all that, but we have to start with like every phase, layer, potential implication of this James Harden stuff. And so to begin here, we know how James Harden got here. We know why he's here. We know what he himself has done wrong in his approach or with what he said, or maybe how he should have gone about things differently. My question to you is, how much do you blame Daryl Morey and or the organization at large for how the Sixers and we all just collectively ended up here?
Yeah, I mean, the Sixers party line all summer has been, we did not want to reach out to him before free agency started because we got dinged for tampering last summer, and we didn't want to test the NBA again. And I don't know whether it's true or not. That's what they're saying. I struggle to believe that there is not a third party that they could have communicated, hey, James, here's the ballpark of what we're willing to offer you. I think, the reality is Houston hires Ime Udoka, and Houston pivots away from interest in James Harden. And all of a sudden, the Sixers are looking around the league and they're like, well, you don't really have a ton of good options left. Like, maybe we can squeeze this guy a little bit. So, whether they tried to just completely ghost him or they, kind of signaled that they were planning to squeeze him. Like, I don't blame them. If he wanted a 4-year max contract and he would be unhappy with anything less than a 4-year max contract, I think that's just unrealistic on his end and not the Sixers. And I don't blame the Sixers for doing it. But, it does seem like the days leading up to free agency, there was a gap in communication. And, I understand if the Sixers are telling the truth, why they did so. But, there is this expectation around the league that you're like, by July 1st or June 30th at 6 p.m., you should have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And it does not seem like that was the case with Harden.
we've kind of alluded to it already, and you mentioned the name. The Ben Simmons situation gets, oh, here we go again. It's the same old story, which really there are some pretty substantial differences between what went on with Simmons and the Sixers compared to what's happening with Harden and the Sixers. One of the many being, there may have been some significant offers out there for Ben Simmons that the Sixers could have taken advantage of. I mean, they did. It's funny to say it now, but they got James Harden, and there were other options before that potentially. Tyrese Halliburton being one. Who knows how real that ever was, but it's different now for Harden because it's really difficult for me, and I've talked to Dan about this, like what's out there. And there's been recent reporting about a Clippers package that may or may not be, somewhere around the 10-yard line. I don't know how to, frame it, but what do you see as a likely conclusion to this, specifically with respect to what can they get for him? What do you, and how close or how far probably is it from what they actually want to get for James Harden?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Daryl Morey said we're either trading him for a star or something that can help us get a star. I don't think they're trading him for a star at this point. I just don't see who's on, Drew moved, Damian Lillard moved, like that. Yeah. There isn't another lingering star trade request on the market unless you feel that strongly about Malcolm Brogdon. So, you alluded to it. Sam Amick and Shams Charania of The Athletic reported earlier today that the Clippers have kind of re-engaged the Sixers and have offered a first-round pick, a pick swap, and expiring contract, salary filler, probably some combination of Marcus Morris, Nick Batum, Robert Covington. The Sixers have telegraphed that they are hoping to keep cap space open for next summer when they could have more than $50 million in cap space. So, Norman Powell was a name that was kicked around when this first popped up earlier this year, and based on what the Sixers have said, I would imagine they'd lean more toward the expirings and draft compensation. It seems like the number of picks that the Clippers send and whether they include Terrence Mann are the sticking points. And I think the Clippers realize they might be bidding against themselves. So much like Miami throughout the Dame Lillard thing, they're probably like, well, we don't, why are we giving up everything if we're the only suitor? And the Sixers are probably saying, well, look how that worked out for Miami. Like, all right, Clippers, you can play that game, but, if another team starts slow, we'll see what happens in Chicago and Toronto in particular. Like, there are a couple teams out there that have stars with very uncertain futures, and all it takes is one other team to jump into the mix. So, I think things are somewhat at a standstill, but it wouldn't shock me if they heat up relatively soon.
So my question is twofold, and I'll start with this one. What is I don't even know. I'm stumbling how to phrase it. Is just, let me go back to my outline here to see how I phrased it there. Do you agree with their prioritization of cap flexibility in next summer, knowing what we know about both who will be available and just how free agency has come to operate over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, it's risky, right? Because if they basically treat this year as a punt year, which Joel Embiid on Media Day, or at Media Day on Monday said, I want to be competing for a championship every year. Like, I do not want to have a gap year. So if, Harden, let's say they don't trade him, he acts out, they suspend him, how they fare without him might determine how happy Joel Embiid is for the rest of this season. Like, it wouldn't shock me if we get to next year's draft and we're, the Sixers are at the same place that the Blazers were with Damian Lillard in April, where he gives his end of season press conference, is like, all right, guys, you got to move the pick. Like, it's time to win. It's time to get this thing going. I think Embiid's probably going to give them this season and the start of free agency next year and then reevaluate from there. So, the list of free agents is interesting in that, Pascal Siakam, OG Anunoby, both of whom played under Nick Nurse. Kawhi Leonard has a player option. He obviously won a title with Nick Nurse as well in Toronto. Paul George has a player option. I think they just have to evaluate how serious of a threat they are to pry. Kawhi and Paul George don't really seem inclined to leave LA. I think that might just be if LA tries to lowball them, maybe they're open to moving elsewhere. Did not seem like there was a lot of love lost between Siakam and Nick Nurse by the end of Nurse's tenure in Toronto. So I think, OG Anunoby strikes me as the most realistic big name free agent target. But it also wouldn't shock me if, Daryl Morey is one of the smarter cap minds out there in front offices, and we're in year one of this new CBA where, Boston and Phoenix in particular have kind of turned up their nose at, the second apron, you're not going to be able to have super teams. You can only have 2 maxes on your books. And they're like, no, that's not true. We can have we 3 or 4 really expensive players. I think he might want to see how that plays out and what it means for the expensive teams next summer. Because, maybe instead of going after a Siakam or an Anunoby or, a big name free agent, maybe he just breaks it up into a couple smaller contracts, then re-signs Maxey, and it's a Maxey Embiid on the maxes, and you've just got a bunch of starting quality players around them. So, they have one of his favorite terms is optionality. They have more optionality than most contenders do, at least in terms of free agency. But that's the only optionality they have because they've already traded 2 first-round picks away. They couldn't get in on Damian Lillard or even Drew Holiday without giving up Tyrese Maxey. And frankly, I don't know that Maxey and 1 pick tops Brogdon and Time Lord and 2 picks from Boston. They just do not have the ammunition to get into a superstar trade war, which I think is also why they're trying to use this Harden trade to kind of replenish their war chest a bit.
Sorry, Grant, but the second part of that for me was, so everything you outlay can all kind of make sense. And so it's not just about what the cap space can turn into in free agency. It's, you mentioned the trade market. And then if you do trade Harden, you could have this ammunition to maybe you do get in, not a superstar trade this year, but over the summer. And you mentioned some of these expensive teams. What if those expensive, what if just Boston kind of flames out in round 1 or gets bounced in the semifinals this year? It's Jaylen Brown's going to be on the block. Or I'm not saying the Sixers would be interested, but one of those expensive stars become available. Is the most, what is then the path to this season? And you mentioned the term gap year. What is the path to this season not being a gap year then if you're waiting or prioritizing any one of those scenarios? Is it actually James Harden sticks with the team all year and is actually playing well? But then if that happens, you're not getting assets for him, so you're still not going to have that superstar ammunition.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm being brutally honest, I don't see either path. James Harden staying, or they trade James Harden to the Clippers for whatever the Clippers have to offer that isn't Kawhi Leonard or Paul George. I don't think either one of them puts them on the level of Boston or Milwaukee. So, I think no matter what, it's kind of be a gap year in terms of legitimate title contention. That isn't to say that they can't turn this year into a valuable experience, though, and I'm sure we're going to get into it with the Nick Nurse stuff. But they have a lot of other big picture questions to answer about this team, and I think it almost harkens back to the process days where you're less concerned with wins and losses and you're more concerned with individual player development. I think this is just going to be a rich man's version of that.
I mean, if we're going to talk I do want to, before we get to, I have so many more questions about this offseason and what the Harden thing has done. Maybe we should do that first, because I have some. Sure. We have Tyrese Maxey questions because we're talking about player development, and there's hardly anybody more important from that standpoint than him. Do you think is there a scenario or is there an explanation for this current situation that, could Daryl Morey say, well, this was unforeseen? I'm surprised that I'm in this position with James Harden. And 2, has this had an effect on, were there other moves that maybe the Sixers would have made had this been done more cleanly? And I don't know if I'm even talking about Harden's just back and we're all good, or had signed him to a new deal, or if he had been traded quickly. If there weren't this cloud, do you think the roster would look different? Are there opportunities they didn't pursue? Are there guys like Niang and McDaniels that might be back or not? Has it had ripple effects, or was this always going to be a situation where, like you said, it kind of is a gap year by default almost? Just I mean, not a real one because that has such a negative connotation. But you see what I'm asking? Like, would this be different if not for the Harden debacle?
Yeah, I think to some extent it would. I mean, I don't know that they would have paid Niang what he got from Cleveland, even Jalen McDaniels what he got from Toronto, or even Shake Milton. I mean, I think honestly, remove the Harden stuff from the equation, and you think of like net loss, net gain from the offseason. They lose, Niang, McDaniels, Shake Milton. They gain Pat Bev, Kelly Oubre Jr., Mo Bamba, Danny Green, all on min deals. You could make a case that they maybe broke even, maybe even got a little better, but obviously this Harden stuff is all overshadowing that, so no one's really focused on that part of it. I mean, I do think the one big change is that they haven't used their taxpayer mid-level exception at all. They're far enough under the second apron that they have access to it, but that would hard cap them at the second apron, which I think they are not particularly interested in doing before they resolve the Harden stuff, because that's, they're far enough under to use it, but not far enough that once they use it, they'd be kind of close. So they, want to preserve as much financial flexibility as possible, so avoid any hard cap stuff, because that's only going to complicate what they're able to take back from Harden, and I think that's the biggest priority to resolve.
You just made me think of something else, and going off outline, which Dan knows I'm prone to doing. If hypothetically, had it been immediately clear that we're no longer, we being the Sixers, in the James Harden business, is there any maybe there's reporting that could just tell me this that I've forgotten? Is there a chance Doc Rivers is back? Was it an either or thing, do you think, or was it more just like, as Doc Rivers tends to do, like, we're kind of that we've run this relationship has run its course, thank you sir, next type of situation?
Based on the quotes that have come out since his dismissal, starting in Summer League and really like this week in particular, it's becoming increasingly clear that James Harden was not the only one who was done with Doc Rivers. So I think he probably wore out. I mean, I just don't know how you come back from that meltdown in Game 7. Like
when Daniel House is throwing shade at you.
Exactly.
What was the Joel Embiid response? They asked, "What's the biggest difference playing for Nick Nurse on offense?" And he was like, "I like it."
It's fun.
It's fun, yeah.
I know. Honestly, like I thought of this analogy earlier today once I saw that Embiid quote. When you've got a friend who's just in like a really toxic relationship, and then they finally get out of it and they start dating someone else, and they're like, "Oh, this person's so nice to me. They like compliment me and they call me to check on how I'm doing, and they like ask about my feelings," and you're like, "That's just normal. It's just normal behavior. Why are you talking about this like it's novel?" That's how the Sixers sound discussing Nick Nurse. They're like, the ball is moving. It's not just Joel and James all the time. Like, the ball is moving, players are moving, and it's like, yeah, that's just basketball. You're just describing basketball. So, yeah, I think it was probably time for Doc either way.
It's really early into training camp as we record this. And all the reporting, at least coming out of that AMIC piece, is that the players, and this has been true before he showed up, they don't really seem to resent James Harden for this at all, which is probably a good thing. James Harden seems to be in good spirits and not participating, but participating. Like, he's not doing live action stuff, but he's still he's not in poor shape. I don't know if anyone said he was in great shape, but they talked about him taking his body seriously. If he's still on this roster when actual regular season games tip off, would you expect him to continue following the course of, while the best way for me to get out of here is to play my ass off, be great, increase my market value, whether it's for the Clippers or someone else? Or do you think at some point he would go full malcontent as sort of the Daryl Morey is a liar quote, the signs he had people holding up at whatever party? He always said, like, what do you think is more likely if he is still on this team during the regular season?
I think if he's smart, he would do the former, but he has shown that he doesn't always follow the best advice, so it wouldn't shock me if he does the latter. I think you're exactly right. I wrote about this like Wednesday morning, right before he showed up to training camp at Liberty Ballers. That exactly, like, this guy has now requested 3 trades in 3.5 years. He's 34, wants a big money long-term deal, has the hamstring injury from a couple years ago that affected him for quite some time. We get the Stephen A. Smith report this week where, Houston was in on him until he goes to Ime Udoka and says, I want to be scoring champ again. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it's clear that Houston pivoted away from interest in him. So, I think he's at the point of his career where he needs to realize that he's not in his prime James Harden anymore. And I'm not totally sure he's there yet, which is already going to narrow the market. I think he makes a ton of sense for the Clippers, and I do think this deal hopefully gets done at some point and is mutually beneficial to all parties. But I think really the best case for him is go out and try hard and boost your market value, because otherwise, if you go and loaf, I don't see why the Sixers wouldn't just send him home and suspend him. I don't think they have to put up with, when he did it for Houston, it's still because he was MVP caliber James Harden. He's not that anymore, and I think the Sixers realize, we're going to be worse without him, but we can survive without him. We don't need him to submarine our season when we've got the reigning MVP.
So I have to jump one question ahead here, or Dan, we can circle back to sort of more Harden specific stuff if you want, but to me, and it's not like some revelation to say this, the most important element in all this is Joel Embiid. And I know he's made assurances, really pretty consistently that, he's happy, he wants to be in Philadelphia and so on and so on. I think of the way I phrased it to you, Dan, the other day was, if in December Joel Embiid demanded a trade, no one on planet Earth would be, oh my, are you really? Are you kidding me? I can't. Joel Embiid, him? Really? There's no scenario where that's a surprise. Mm-hmm. What do you think the best outcome, maybe in the short term, in the next couple weeks, and then as the season goes on, is, with specific focus on what's the thing that makes it less likely that Joel Embiid does change his mind or does, angle to get out and doesn't want to wait through this gap year? What hypothetical do you see as the best way to make sure Embiid continues to be consistent in saying, I do want to be here? Because these things end somewhat predictably. To me, it just seems like it's a question of when. How do we push the when back?
Yeah, I completely agree. Short of the Clippers, offering Paul George or something for James Harden, which I don't see, remove the Harden stuff from the equation, as difficult as that may be. I think the other big thing and big question looming over them this season is the ceiling of Tyrese Maxey. So, they're already prepping, whether Harden returns or not, to have Maxey operating more of an on-ball role. Whether he takes a leap as a playmaker in particular, because that's been one of his, I wouldn't say weaknesses necessarily, but not one of his strengths. So if he turns into a 7-8 assist per game kind of guy, that raises the ceiling, I think, of the team as a whole. And it also provides more clarity about the long-term type of backcourt partner they need next to him, which, again, with the possibility of $50 million in cap space or trade James Harden and we're all of a sudden have these assets to go star hunting again. I think that's one of the biggest questions they need answered. If Tyrese Maxey is a long-term piece of the team, which it sounds like they want him to be, how do we best complement him? Whether it's, if he could be this full-time playmaker, then we can go a little bit of a bigger guard who's better at defense, who can be more of a secondary ball handler. If he, struggles in this role, or we don't think he can adequately fill this role, then we need a bigger playmaker, still good on defense, and we could have him operate off the ball. So I think how Maxey adjusts to this new role, might either give Embiid confidence that, okay, yeah, I can roll with this guy, and this guy can be my co-star for the next 5 years, and I'm happy to be in Philly, or no, ooh, this guy face planted in this role, and there is no hope here anymore.
Is there any chance, what is the timeline for Joel Embiid reaching DEFCON, get me the fuck out of here? Is there any version of this season or of this saga where that gets accelerated and you're all of a sudden concerned this season, or is it very much that's at the absolute earliest something could happen next summer?
I would be surprised if it happened before next summer. Maybe not surprised, because Grant, as you said, at this point, any day could happen. And it's like, okay, yeah, that you've put up with so much crap over the years. Like, you've served your time, sir. You are free to go elsewhere. But I think, he wants to see how they resolve the Harden thing first and foremost. And, I'm sure Daryl Morey has sold him on, look, like, we're not giving Tyrese Maxey this extension this year because we are keeping his cheap cap hold on the books, because we have this flexibility that no contender has. So, how do we, whether it's a trade, whether it's free agency, what do we do with that flexibility next summer? And then if we get to July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, much like the Blazers with Dame this year, he kind of put them on the clock. They didn't do anything at the draft. Free agency opened. They re-signed Jeremy Grant, and that was it. And Dame was like, all right, I'm out of here. I think if we get to July 3rd next year and the Sixers, like Kawhi re-signs, Paul George re-signs, OG, Pascal either re-sign or go elsewhere, and they are looking at, okay, maybe, I don't know who the Gordon Hayward, like if that's the best case scenario in free agency, then yeah, I would imagine at that point we're at DEFCON 1.
We're going to leave this topic really shortly. And before we do, I just want to give you a chance. Is there anything that, any big picture aspect of this, any slant on it? Or you can't say find new slants with, that was accidental. Any angle here or any facet of this whole Harden Sixers, offseason situation that is under discussed or that you have an opinion on that maybe is not getting enough the coverage you think maybe that it should?
I just think there is a funny sense of irony in that if this whole thing was a miscommunication, or maybe not even miscommunication, a lack of communication leading up to free agency, it's funny that had this happened a year later, this wouldn't apply, because the new CBA, you could start negotiating with your own free agents one day after the finals. So the Sixers just got kind of screwed by timing here, which, I guess the good thing is if they don't trade Harden, if he buys back in and they get to this point next summer when he's still on the roster, at least they'll have clarity leading up to June 30th this time.
Is that, I guess this will be the real final question, is that even a possibility? Is there a scenario where these two are just stuck with each other for the entire year? Or if you had to predict right now, and I'm forcing you to, like, how do you see this thing ultimately ending?
I mean, based on the Amick report today, that was like the first time it's actually sounded like the Clippers are seriously trying to acquire him. Before it was just like, oh, he's available? Okay, we'll just lowball and see if they'll take it. I think they've realized that Morey is just not the person to mess with in that regard. So I imagine he ends up on the Clippers at some point. I just think it makes so much sense for them being in this kind of all-in window right now with Kawhi and Paul George, and with their futures also uncertain. I think he would be such a good fit with those guys. So I would imagine that he goes there. I don't know when. I don't know what ultimately the trade package is going to be. I would be pretty surprised if he makes it past the trade deadline in Philly. I think he knows, I've written about this at Liberty Ball as well, but his bird rights are the only way he's getting a 9-figure deal next summer. Like, the Sixers don't have to work with him on a sign and trade, especially if they're trying to preserve cap space for something else. No other contender is projected to have cap space next summer other than the Sixers. So he knows if I'm still on the Sixers on February 8th, my options are a lot more limited in free agency next year. And I would imagine even if he is, comes into the season, plays the good soldier for a little while, if he's still on the roster in January or even February, that's when we start to see the, end of Houston days Harden.
Yeah. Okay, mercifully, basketball stuff.
Yes, please.
Hey, we did it under 30.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
That's not bad.
Nick Nurse is the new head coach. Broadly, what do you think about the hire compared to what some of the alternatives might have been? What are you excited about? What do you think will be the most noticeable differences on either end of the floor, or just culturally? Give me your Nick Nurse kind of hopes and dreams or concerns.
Yeah, well, I mean, Raptors fans certainly had me concerned after the hire, because they were, laughing. It was like, oh, okay. I thought we were happy that Doc Rivers is gone, but I guess we have to think twice about this. I think obvious concern is he ran, especially Van Vliet and Siakam, into the ground by the end of his tenure there. And Joel Embiid, with his injury history, is not the type of player you want to do that with. So, he has talked about, and Morey has talked about this too, actually. Like, their sports science people are not as big into load management. They actually think it's better for him to play more. And Embiid has even said this too. He says, like, I get out of shape in like 4 to 5 days if I don't play. So I want to play every game.
Same.
Yeah, right. Yeah, me too. Like, I don't want him to play 38 minutes a game for all 82 games. So how Nurse manages minutes, I think, is something I'll be keeping a pretty close eye on. But again, like, they have been pretty glowing reviews so far about Nurse's system, especially from Daniel House Jr. Tobias Harris has been pretty vocal about it as well. So I think we will see more ball movement, more player movement. Danny Green was talking at Media Day about when, he was on the Raptors for the 2018-19 season where they won the championship. And he was discussing when they went to the box and 1 and the triangle and 2 in the finals against the Warriors. And he was like, you should have seen our faces when this man said this. Like, we thought he was crazy, but then it actually worked. And he's earned this lifetime of loyalty from me. So I think having someone like Danny, assuming he makes the team, which is not guaranteed at this point, but I think they probably brought him in for that reason, to be the veteran leader, locker room guy that he was for them a couple of years ago as well. But now with his experience with Nick Nurse, to be like, hey guys, this guy is going to try out some wild stuff at times. And it's going to be very different from Doc Rivers, who was very static and we didn't experiment all that much. I think that culture is something that really all contenders should have during the regular season. Like, if you know you're going to make the playoffs, if you know you're going to be a 50-win team, the entire point of the regular season is figure out what's going to work in the playoffs. And I think last year with the Sixers, Doc ran the Embiid pick and roll into the ground, just spammed it, and it was really effective. It makes sense. If you've got a play that's that lethal, of course you want to spam it. But then the Boston Celtics in the second round figured it out, save for Game 5, and the Sixers didn't really have a counterpunch. So I think under Nurse, they're going to be a lot less predictable, and there are going to be definitely some times where he tries out weird lineups that don't work at all. But his willingness to experiment, like, I'm not worried that he's going to, try to convince Daryl Morey to sign the washed corpse of DeAndre Jordan or Paul Millsap or Dwayne Dedman or anything like that. Like, I think he wants to play. He's going to give guys opportunities that they didn't have last year. And I think, House in particular sounds very excited about that because he was on the fringes of Doc's rotation for most of the year, which seemed like a total waste of a biannual exception, especially when they lost a second-round pick for tampering with him.
Are there any, you mentioned the experimentation, and I think, as you mentioned, we will see a ton of that on offense. Do you see the potential for that to happen on defense at all, where maybe they're playing more aggressively on defense? Is that happening maybe in lineups where Embiid isn't there because you have Paul Reed and Oubre and Maxey, none of whom I would say are maybe Reed, but aren't super net plus defenders, but they have the ability to play aggressively? Or do you expect the Sixers base defense to sort of remain the same?
Yeah, he's actually talked about he wants Embiid to be challenging more shots this year, which I think is interesting. So I think he wants them to be more aggressive, even if it leads to some breakdowns at times. It makes me nervous because I feel like most of Embiid's playoff injuries have been when he's going for these blocks, especially in the past 2 years. So I hope he can do that while staying healthy. But yeah, I think, we barely at all, if ever, saw Paul Reed play next to Embiid last season. Nurse has already said we're going to see more of that this year. But between Melton, PJ Tucker, Patrick Beverly, Jaden Springer, if he can crack the rotation, they have some intriguing defensive personnel. And I think Nurse is going to look to tap into that wherever he can.
You hit on this a little bit earlier, and it made me really reconsider what I thought about, the talent give and take that the Sixers have undergone this offseason. What do you think about the new additions? And granted, they didn't have, the ton of tools to go out and, get a bunch of, big needle movers, but it does seem like they did fairly well with the resources that they had. So I guess maybe the question is, which of the new additions are you most intrigued by? Which do you think will play the biggest roles, and what might that look like?
Yeah, I think Oubre is the default answer just based on what he did last year in Charlotte. Obviously, he's not going to have that kind of a role in Philly, but they haven't really had this like microwave scorer off the bench since Alec Burks a couple of years ago, and before that, even like Lou Williams, like pre-process. So it's been a while since they've had someone like that, and really their wing depth at the start of the offseason, you're like, oh my god, they have Tobias and PJ Tucker, and other than that, it's like House and Furkan Korkmaz. They got nothing. We'll see what Danny Green still has left in the tank. Hopefully, now that he's more than a year removed from the injury, he can help them out in that regard. And he was really good for them during his 2 seasons in Philly before the injury. But I think Oubre is the obvious answer. Beverly, I think, is probably going to be more influential off the court than on, but I think he will still have a role on the court as well, and did make a difference, especially for Chicago after ending up with them last year. So backup, assuming Harden is back and he's in the starting lineup, like a second unit backcourt of Pat Bev and DeAnthony Melton does not sound like very fun to go against, especially with Nick Nurse leading them.
You mentioned Tyrese Maxey before, and I'm curious about the new role he's going to be in. What are you monitoring most closely when it comes to if he's going to swing into develop into this star, this player that maybe Joel Embiid looks at and says, "Oh, I could stay here even if the Harden package is more of a poo-poo platter." What is the skill or the swing aspect of his game that you'll be watching most closely? Is it the playmaking in the half court? Can he up his off the dribble shooting? Like, he hit like 39% of his pull-up threes last year, but they weren't a huge part of his game. What's the most important aspect of his development moving forward?
Yeah, I think definitely the playmaking and kind of, how you handle the push and pull of leaning into your scoring, because that's still, his strength. He is a dynamic 3-level scorer. He's got the speed that few guys in the league can keep up with, especially in transition. And, he's really increased his off the dribble shooting, I think, a lot in part thanks to James Harden. Like, as soon as James Harden came, he started working the step back 3 more into his game. And, the Sixers tweeted a clip of training camp yesterday, I think. And, he already showed off like a behind the back pass with Embiid in the pick and roll that he did not have last year. So, I think he went into this offseason, especially after June 30th, knowing, okay, I'm going to have to take on more of an on-ball role this year. And, again, seeing how he handles that is going to have both short and long-term implications for the Sixers' future.
This may be an unfair question, but I'm so interested in your perspective on Maxey. What are you most optimistic about him as we're looking at him as from a growth perspective? What are you most optimistic that he will successfully add to his game, and what are you kind of more skeptical that he where might we be asking too much of him as he takes on this new role? Like, what do you think he maybe? I don't know if he's going to quite be able to do this in a bigger role.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think based on his work ethic and the way he's improved since coming into the NBA, I don't want to rule anything out. I mean, everyone around the team just absolutely adores the kid. So I think he's going to do whatever his body allows him to do. So I think he will take a step forward as a playmaker this year. He would get mad if he hears this, but I think defense is the other big question. He hates people asking him about it, but he does have a smaller frame. So I don't think he ever turns into a lockdown defender necessarily. I think he'll continue to improve in that regard. I don't think he's like a Trae Young, absolute disaster on that end of the floor. But that's probably the one area that I think he's just limited by his frame more than anything else.
I'm actually more optimistic, I think, on him defensively than a lot of other people. I think that he's shown like really long moments of like being able to fight, being able to put real pressure on it. He's given some guys like last year, there was, I can't remember what, it was a couple games, I feel like, where he gave Fred VanVleet like really big
Mm-hmm.
issues. You can count on him to, I don't want to use the word derail or shut down, but make life difficult on guys of that caliber. That's like, I know some people think point of attack defense is overrated, especially if you are the point guard, but like being able to do something like that is, I would say, pretty valuable. And that leads me into my final Tyrese Maxey question, which is like, is the expectation here like, oh, he's just going to get the max in restricted free agency next year? And that's kind of why they're one waiting, and two, why they're not worried about maybe souring the relationship with him by sort of delaying that payday.
Yeah, I would imagine that's the expectation. I think the cap growth is going to outstrip any potential of that deal aging poorly. Maybe it's slightly less than the max because I think that's kind of the next frontier for a lot of teams, especially as we get deeper into this new CBA. They're going to try to reason with their guys and say, hey, there's this second apron that we really, really, really don't want to go over, and here's how you taking 10, 15, 20 million less than the max could help us long term avoid that. But I mean, I think assuming he continues on the trajectory that he's been on in his first 3 years and shows improvement as a playmaker, as a scorer, defensively this year, I would have no hesitation giving him a 5-year max next summer.
Well, that'll finally settle the how do we rank Tyler Hero, Tyrese Maxey, Jordan Poole, and Anthony Simons. We won't have to argue about it anymore. Although probably Maxey deserves to be at the top of that class now anyway.
Oh, for sure. I am curious if because those are still Anthony Simons. I feel like his deal is actually kind of a bargain and people don't talk about it. But with Hero, RJ Barrett, even Jordan Poole, the conversation surrounding those guys changed so starkly after they signed their extension that I'm just curious to see if the same happens with Maxey when he's like actually off his rookie scale and signs that deal. I really don't think it will, because I actually think by far of all the players we just named, he's clearly the best already and probably has the highest ceiling, I would believe. But I am just curious because the way that I think fandom and analysis can even work sometimes is once these players are no longer underpaid coming off their rookie scales, or maybe they signed a below market deal in the first place, just the conversation surrounding them changes.
Yeah.
Well, you say that now, Dan, but once Jordan Poole is averaging 33 a game on 45% true shooting, we're really going to get our answer. Paul Reed, Brian, he's another interesting piece, not just because of the weird Utah Jazz restricted free agency contract. We can get into that too, but I enjoyed that. Can you just pretend that Dan and I don't know, this is a pretty niche basketball sicko podcast and people probably know Paul Reed and like what his game is, but pretend we don't. What kind of player is Paul Reed? What does he need to do better or more consistently to really just be someone that he's the backup big. We love it. He's going to be great. He's going to be a value add. Like what has he been to this point, and what do you think he needs to do to really become more than like a weird like niche basketball point of interest?
What do you also think he needs to do to prevent the Sixers from reacquiring DeAndre Jordan at the trade deadline?
Have them not hire Doc Rivers again. I think that's step one. Paul Reed's, I mean, everyone just loves him in Philly. I think in part because he was the only big under the age of 35 that they played over the last couple of years, only backup big. Yeah, right, exactly. He's not fossilized. I think he's pretty clearly the best backup big they've had in the Embiid era, which is kind of sad to some extent because, he still has a lot of room to grow. But again, like all of the other guys they've put behind Embiid, they've just gotten absolutely killed whenever they're on the court. And Reed, especially last year after the trade deadline when he finally supplanted Dwayne Dedmon in the rotation, was very, very good. He's just long, springy, athletic, switchable defensively, which again is something with, the Bobans and Greg Monroes of the world, something they just haven't had before. I think the one major area of growth for him beyond just, getting acclimated to Nick Nurse's new system and knowing where to be at all times. He improved a lot in the pick and roll last year with James Harden, which was nice to see. So hopefully he, whether Harden's on the team, maybe he does it with Maxey instead. The one area of growth, you want to see him shoot threes more. He did in the G League, and he was actually a pretty good three-point shooter, and he said, he's prioritized that this offseason, but, that's obviously going to be the key to playing him next to Joel Embiid in particular. You can't have two guys who can't space the floor at all, unless you're the Cleveland Cavaliers. So I think if he is a willing and able shooter and can knock down 35% of his threes, especially in the corners, then yeah, the Embiid-Reed pairing could be viable on both ends of the floor, and frankly, could be really interesting defensively in particular.
Yeah, I was going to ask, you think, assuming he is, viable as something of a floor spacer offensively to keep the lane kind of uncluttered, do you think he is like a realistic guy that maybe he's going to switch 1 through 4, or, at least survive out there? Like, that's a real thing that he's potentially going to be able to do defensively?
I think so. I mean, we'll see in bigger minutes, because he really just didn't get a ton of opportunity really throughout his career. But up until the trade deadline last year, we saw it at the very end of the 21-22 season, and then for a couple months at the end of last season. So I think this is going to be his best opportunity by far. Nick Nurse has already talked about him as trying to mold him like Siakam, which I think is pretty interesting, because you could see some similarities in how they play. I think obviously Siakam is a much better player than Paul Reed at this point, but him seeing that type of potential in Paul Reed is interesting. And I know at Media Day, Mo Bamba was saying, one of the reasons he signed with the Sixers, because he took a 1-year min deal, so he could have taken the same contract anywhere, was Nurse's history of playing two bigs together in Toronto. So, I think Nurse has shown that hasn't shied away from that, despite the way the NBA is trending, and he'll have the personnel to at least experiment with it in Philly too.
Are you ready to enter the cookie cutter portion of
Yes.
the NBA Look Ahead podcast?
Yes.
Are there any talked about, underrated strengths and or weaknesses about this team that we have yet to really touch upon?
I think wing depth is a concern, especially when, you're going to go into the playoffs and likely face some combination of Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Jimmy Butler, Chris Middleton, Giannis Antetokounmpo at some point. I just, again, don't really see how they match up well against either of those teams, frankly. I think Embiid, too. It's funny that he's coming off of this MVP season, and, both inside of Philly and outside, everyone's just kind of down on him, which, I get it, because they flamed out in the playoffs again, but Embiid today was saying, hey, man, this system's going to be different. I'm not just going to be a scorer. I'm going to be more of a facilitator, which is also what we saw in the beginning of the 21-22 season when Ben Simmons was sitting out. They played a lot more through Embiid. And, Embiid last year at times said, if I had the opportunity, I could play like Jokic. I could average 8, 9, 10 assists per game, and everyone just rolled their eyes, and for good reason. He is not the passer that Nikola Jokic is, but he has improved as a playmaker in recent years. He's gotten much better at reading double teams in particular. So just seeing how he and Nurse coalesce, I think, is obviously going to be one of the biggest stories of the season. And it's because of the Harden stuff and the Maxey questions and everything hasn't gotten a ton of attention. And then DeAnthony Melton too. I mean, if Harden does either hold out or get traded and Melton moves into the starting lineup, he's in the contract year. So this is going to be a big opportunity for him to prove, am I the long-term backcourt partner to Tyrese Maxey? Can I be a viable starter on a championship caliber team?
I was going to ask, is there any concern about, I don't want to say Joel Embiid burnout, but he's now in consecutive seasons at a career high for total minutes played. And look, the Sixers, It was one of my. They're not built to necessarily play differently when you're structuring everything around Joel Embiid and James Harden. But if Nick Nurse is looking to play, let's even say just one star lineups with Embiid, and maybe it's Maxey and Harden on the court, and they want to play a little faster. And the Sixers, I think, were 27th in average offensive possession time. Just the combination of, we talked about he wants to play more. He gets out of shape if he doesn't in 4 or 5 days. But knowing the minutes load he just shouldered the past 2 seasons, and then if the Sixers maybe do decide to experiment and play a little faster with him or ask him to do even more on the offensive end, is there any just concern about Joel Embiid burnout?
Yeah, I think there's a huge concern about that. I mean, that is, the question with Nick Nurse is he going to overplay him? Because they do now have at least 2 other viable options in Paul Reed and Bamba. Also have Filip Petrusev, assuming he makes the team. I'm not saying he's going to play a ton of minutes or even be in the rotation, but they have other guys to try in the front court. And as long as PJ Tucker's on the team, you can get really weird. And we can go back to the tuck wagon at the 5 lineups. I expect Nurse to try a bunch of different combinations of guys. So I think by virtue of that should help keep Embiid's minutes in check. But again, I do not want to see Joel Embiid playing 38 minutes a game like Siakam or VanVleet was last season. That's just a recipe for he's either on fumes by April when we get to the playoffs, or he's out nursing some sort of injury.
Do you think you just keep making me think of other questions that aren't
do
on
it do it
Does Tucker have anything left? Or maybe the better way to frame it is he someone that is a viable postseason player just because of the low volume shooting? And I mean, the age thing, at some point he's defied the aging curve, for like the better part of a decade now. But do you still view him as someone that is I don't even know, is he integral to the best version of the Sixers? Or is he someone that maybe, as we talked about Paul Reed, it might not be the worst thing if Paul Reed does sort of eat into those minutes and Tucker kind of gets a little bit marginalized. What does he have left in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's so dependent on an elite playmaker like James Harden that it wouldn't shock me if in a Harden trade he also gets moved.
Oh, interesting.
I'm just speculating on that. I don't know for sure, but I think it would make sense, and I think he could also make sense on the Clippers because they're gonna, if they do send some combination of Covington, Morris, Batum, they are gonna potentially need a little more depth behind Kawhi and PG. And if Maxey takes this major leap as a playmaker, then maybe Maxey can fill that role and still feed him those corner threes, and maybe he's less reluctant to take them this year. Also, again, maybe they actually figure out ways to use him offensively beyond just park him in the corner, which is basically all he did under Doc Rivers. I mean, we saw it in Miami. He was actually, had kind of a late career renaissance with them. So I think that is a good under the radar storyline for the Sixers is what does PJ Tucker have left? Was last year because he's just, 38 or whatever he is? Or was it just Doc Rivers was so focused on Harden and Embiid that he didn't really devise any sort of special schemes or anything to utilize the rest of the team correctly? I do think leadership-wise he's important. I mean, I go back to the Game 4 against Boston where it's late in the game and Tucker just gets in Joel Embiid's face and yells at him and ultimately snaps him out of whatever funk he's in. They end up winning that game. I genuinely don't think they would had Tucker not have that conversation with a minute left in the game or whatever it was. So I think from that perspective, he and Danny Green and Pat Bev could be very, very valuable to the team, even if they are not, putting up 15 points a game, which I wouldn't expect from any of them at this stage of their career.
We really haven't mentioned him, and I'm surprised, is Tobias Harris, knowing the state of both the Harden situation, the Sixers prioritizing flexibility, and then also Nick Nurse coming in and maybe want to diversify in the offense, is he more important right now to the Sixers as an actual player? And do you see him being someone who could benefit from Nurse coming in? And two, or is he still kind of just viewed as just this massive, massive, gargantuan human trade exception?
Both? Can I just say yes?
You want to pick one. Is it
Okay. Uh, I think he's probably still more of a human trade exception because, again, I think we get to the trade deadline and we'll see how teams are handling this new second apron stuff. But, a lot more or the full array of restrictions go into effect next summer. The draft pick freezing, you can't trade the draft pick 7 years in the future, can't aggregate contracts, can't take back any more salary than you send out. So we'll see which teams are in line to be over that limit next offseason. But I think this trade deadline is going to be one of the last opportunities to make those sorts of salary dumps. And the Sixers, unless the Warriors move off of Klay Thompson, Tobias Harris is the biggest contract who is going to be expiring. So they do have that lifeline for any team that needs it. But shout out to my guys, Kyle Neubeck and Derek Bodner at Philly Sports, PHLY Sports, the new network over there. They sat down with Tobias at Media Day, and he talked about what's kind of going to be his role in this Nick Nurse offense. And he also said, there's going to be a lot more opportunities for me. I'm going to run pick and roll more, which I think is going to be interesting. He talked about post-ups, which, he actually does have a pretty good post-up game. It's not new. He's been doing that for a while. I also just said he's going to launch as many threes as he possibly can. But I think, his agent / father went viral over the summer when they said, Terrell Harris said they weren't using Tobias right, that he could be an assassin scorer. So I hope that we get to see the assassin scorer version of Tobias Harris this year. I think he's still going to be third or fourth in the offensive pecking order, depending on whether Harden comes back. But, if this more everyone gets touches and everyone gets a piece of the pie offense of Nick Nurse comes true, then, hopefully he won't be have as minimal of a role as he did last year when he, I think he had his fewest points since his Orlando days.
I will say it feels like people still read too much into his pay grade because he's still, when you look at the defensive assignments that he has to take on, regardless of how good and valuable you think he is defensively, coupled with his ability to kind of fit into all these weird or different archetypal offensive roles, even if it's not the volume at which you would prefer to see. I actually think he's more valuable to them as a player right now, because when you don't have picks to really include in trades and you don't want to take on long-term money to begin with, what is the real value of having this $40 million expiring contract then in a trade if you can't necessarily attach anything to him and you don't want to take back a massive amount? I guess if there's a star that's making a ton of money and you're able to get them for a pittance, then yeah, sure. But it feels like just the way this is tracking that he's more critical to them as a contributor than this trade piece.
Yeah. I mean, I think it wouldn't shock me if they don't move him at all. He becomes an unrestricted free agent next summer.
And comes back.
It wouldn't totally shock me if he came back. Yeah, I mean, hopefully at a slightly lower AAV than what he had on this previous deal. But I mean, I think you're totally right, Dan. If you remove the contract from the player, he's still a helpful player. He's still a very good player. It's just he got paid probably twice as much, or 50% more than he should have, and that's I think it's fair to be frustrated by that because that does have some real team building implications as well.
So Harris is starting, Maxey is starting, Joel Embiid is starting, Tucker is probably starting, James Harden, or if it's not James Harden, it sounds like maybe you're of the mind that it might be DeAnthony Melton in the backcourt with Maxey. Can you shake out the, or if you disagree with any of that?
There's no Shake Milton here. He can't shake it out. Sorry, he's gone. He's in Minnesota.
Too soon.
And then what's the next five guys look like? If, just guessing from today, what does the rest of that 10-man rotation look like? Or maybe it goes deeper, or maybe it's shallower than that, in your opinion.
Yeah, so I think if Harden is back, it's the same starting lineup as last year, and then probably Pat Bev, Melton, maybe Danny Green, Oubre, and Paul Reed, and then Bamba competing for minutes, Korkmaz competing for minutes, Daniel House competing for minutes. Again, you go down this roster and they have 10, 11, 12 legitimate rotation players. So, Nick Nurse said on Media Day, we actually have a competition at the wing, and I'm excited to kind of see who wins it. I hope that House actually cracks the rotation this year. And, if they do make this Harden trade for the Clippers guys, I think one of the underrated subplots of this is, did they miss the window for this to be a lot easier when the Sixers had not filled out their roster? Right now, they're one over the regular season roster limit, and they can very easily get under waive Petrosev or waive Montrezl Harrell, who, unfortunately got injured during the offseason, is going to miss the whole season. But, if they do a 3-for-1 or a 4-for-1, all of a sudden, you might have to take back another player. Maybe they have to send out Korkmaz as well, just because they don't. Clearly, I don't think they're going to want to part ways with Kelly Oubre on a min deal. So, I think a lot is still up in the air for them, especially in regard to, spots 6 through 10. I think Melton, assuming Harden back, Melton, Paul Reed, guaranteed to have roles in the rotation, and then probably a competition between Pat Bev and Jaden Springer. I'm guessing Pat Bev is ahead in that conversation, and then the wings between Danny Green, House, Korkmaz if he's still around, Oubre of course. So there's still a lot to shake out over these next couple weeks.
Do you expect, again, everything's just written in pencil because of Harden stuff, but is their starting unit going to be their preferred closing five, or do you see the potential maybe for Melton to get in there, maybe subbing out PJ Tucker or any different? And we also know that Nick Nurse is one of those head coaches that does play to the matchups and change things more than some others. So is there any curveball there, or would you expect, if this roster stayed the same, it's the starting five, it's just the closing five?
Yeah, I would think it'd probably be that, with Melton as the swing piece, or maybe even Paul Reed as the swing piece, if we find out that this Embiid-Reed pairing works out better than expected. I would not hate seeing Tobias slide up more to the 4 this year. I mean, we'll see what Oubre brings to the table and how he fits into the system. I think he's probably the big, other, Tyrese Maxey is the X factor of the team, but Kelly Oubre is probably the other one, because it's rare to get someone with that type of scoring upside, even though he's not the most efficient at scoring. Can he fit into more of a 3-and-D role? Can he be a better three-point shooter? Can he be more judicious with his shot selection? If so, maybe he does end up closing some games for them, or factoring more into the rotation than just fringe 9th or 10th man.
Got any weird, quirky lineups that you're hoping to see? This is really a Dan question, so I feel terrible. He's the one that always has the weirdo suggestions for these things.
The only thing you should feel terrible about is not saying that it's a universally beloved and cherished question by everybody. Because it's clearly, this is why the people come to tune in.
Yeah. I think we can get really weird with this team. And that's what I want Nick Nurse to do. I do not want to see the same starting lineup for 82 games, the same closing lineup for 82 games. Let's find out if Reed and Embiid can play together. Let's find out if the Tuck Wagon lineups are still valuable, even though he's, closer to 40 than he is 30 at this point. Let's see how Melton fares as a point guard. I mean, we found out the answer last year, and it was not especially great, but he's had his offseason to work on that now, and he was joking about his finishing on media day, or his lack thereof of being able to finish layups. So it sounds like that was a clear focus for him this offseason. But I'd say you could come up with just a dog lineup of Pat Bev, Melton, Tucker, Paul Reed, I guess Daniel House in there too. That just sounds like the most annoying lineup to play against. Yeah. Might not be able to score a single point. But man, I guess no half-court points. They will only score in transition, and that's it. So that might be my answer.
Are you excited for when Nick Nurse puts the Sixers in a 3-2 zone and calls it a pentagon and 0? It features only guys that are 6'7" to 6'9". That's what I don't know if that's a lineup thing, but I'm ready for that level of innovation.
Yeah, he's going to be really disturbed when he realizes that's the one archetype the Sixers don't have.
I really hope, and you kind of alluded to this, they can't lean on this because you want Embiid, and even if you have Harden on the floor, but take those two off the floor. Let's get the Melton, Maxey, Paul Reed, and Oubre on the floor. And then like the fifth, I think I'd probably lean Tobias Harris, but it could be PJ Tucker. Like, let's just see how fast those guys could play. And that I think would be a different element to this team. Like to go if you're able to buy some starless units, or maybe can you play faster with Embiid as the 5 in that lineup, where he can just kind of trail everything as the 5th with next to Paul Reed, Oubre, Melton, and Maxey. I don't know how I feel about the spacing necessarily, but if Harris or Embiid, like they stretch the floor for their positions, and so I just want to see something like that. Like that's a lineup that I'm hoping to see.
Yeah, I'm fully on board with getting weird.
So as we record this, which is James Harden is still on the team, and it is. Did you want to say something, Grant?
No. I was just looking at this over under and trying to think what I was going to say if it was supposed to. Go ahead.
So October 5th, they're over under. James Harden's still here again, 48.5. Knowing all the uncertainty that is caked in to this team, Brian Toporek, are you taking the over or the under? And my follow-up to that, so you can go right into it, is how many teams right now in the East are you prepared to guarantee are going to be better than the Sixers?
Yeah, so they've gone over that number each of the last 3 years, even though one of those was a 72-game season. That includes the 21-22 season. They went 51-31. That was when Ben Simmons sat out for half the season. So even if Harden sits out, which I don't get the impression he's going to do because he values his money more than Ben Simmons did, I mean, it's tempting to take the over here. Like, I think we might have all overcorrected a bit because of the Harden drama and because we've seen how it played out in Houston and Brooklyn in particular. And we're just like, oh, God, this again. But, if they went 51-31 that year with only, Maxey and Embiid basically leading the team for half the season, with Doc Rivers as the head coach, they had Seth Curry back then, they had Thibault, they had George Yang, they had Shake Milton. But, again, depending on how you feel about their off-season moves, like Paul Reed barely played. Like Maxey's going to be 2 years older and much more experienced. Paul Reed's going to be in the actual rotation this year. So, barring a long-term Joel Embiid injury, I'm tempted to lean slightly over. As for the teams that are going to be better than them in the East, I think Boston and Milwaukee clearly. Embiid kind of bristled at that at Media Day because a lot of people were alluding to, these teams made these huge moves and are clearly better than you guys. And he was like, who says they're better than us? We got to actually play it out on the court, which, I think the results on the court are going to say that those two teams are still better than the Sixers. But I think you could make a case that they're in that next tier. I think Cleveland, given the upgrades they made this offseason, given the possibility of improvement from Evan Mobley in particular, and also even, Darius Garland, and, seeing how he and Donovan Mitchell work together in their second year, but with the additions of Niang and Max Strus, I would imagine, put them in a playoff series, and I think it'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But I think Cleveland's probably better equipped to win more regular season games than the Sixers. But, other than that, I think the Heat have a higher ceiling in the playoffs, which we've seen over the last couple of years, but I think the Heat also don't really take the regular season seriously. So wouldn't shock me if the Sixers had more wins than them. I think I'd put them in the same neighborhood of the Knicks, of the Brooklyn Nets. I think I'd have them over. Atlanta, I think I'd have them over at this point. So, I think you could still make a case that even with all of this, everything surrounding them, they're possibly the third or fourth best team in the East still, which is remarkable, frankly.
And before I defer to Grant here, you mentioned just that people have kind of been underrating what the Sixers can be without James Harden. And in that context, you're right. If you sub in Anthony Melton for James Harden, that lineup had a 15+ net rating last year. And if you just look at the minutes they played with Harris, Embiid, and Maxey and no Harden, they had almost a 20 net rating. And again, the sample sizes are small. We're talking about 500+ possessions. But when you move Harden, you're not going to get nothing until there will be something there. So Grant and I obviously haven't done our over-under pod yet, but I think there's something to you saying sentiment might be too low on just the Sixers generally speaking. Like, no, maybe they're not this elite team if the Harden situation goes awry, but using the Ben Simmons year as an analog, and then plus just with that data, it's there's still stuff here.
I mean, like, they have an MVP in his prime. Like, the floor is real high, right? Like, injuries are a concern for everybody, and maybe more so for Embiid than a lot. But like, it's just this. When's the last time a healthy MVP in his prime was on a team that didn't at least like threaten 49 wins? That's that's why the line is where it is. But I like your logic, Brian. I think we have kind of maybe like started overlooking the Sixers prematurely as at least the playoff for sure, but regular season, I think they might still be really good. Do we not touch on anything that you think warrants a little bit of coverage or discussion about this team? Whether that's a deep roster guy that you're kind of interested in, or just a broader angle that we haven't hit on.
Yeah, I think we've hit on all the big ones for sure. Jaden Springer, I'm intrigued to see if he cracks the rotation this year, and if does, what he brings to the table. I mean, coming into camp last year, PJ Tucker was like, this guy's really good defensively already, and he doesn't even know what he's doing yet. So, how he's developed over the summer, especially offense, is going to be the key. If he can space the floor, if he can, dribble. How all of these guys adapt to Nick Nurse's new system, I think, is going to determine playing time early in the year. And I think based on the offseason additions, especially of Patrick Beverley, I'm guessing he ends up being the third point guard in the rotation. So, plays fourth quarter blowout minutes, not much else than that. But if anyone goes down, does he actually get an opportunity in the rotation? Because frankly, that's been an area that the Sixers have been lacking in recent years, is giving their young guys enough time to develop and get regular season reps. It cost them Isaiah Joe last year, which the Thunder, my beloved Oklahoma City Thunder, are reaping the rewards
Finally. Took you an hour and 11 minutes, but you got to them.
That's right. We had to get there somewhere. Charles Bassey was another one who showed some flashes last year with San Antonio after he got waived from the Sixers. So, they just don't have a ton of, other than Maxey and Reed, they really don't have a ton of young, high upside guys. I mean, I know Sixers fans are excited about Turk Smith, who's on a 2-way deal. So we'll see how much he plays, if at all, this year. I mean, I imagine he's going to be mostly in the G League, but I think they really do need to replenish that youth pipeline, especially if they're thinking like, oh crap, Embiid might request a trade within a year. It's like, okay, well, if that happens, then you've got Tyrese Maxey, Paul Reed, and filling the blanks there is going to be really important for them. So, Springer is in the third year of his rookie scale deal. They're going to have to, I don't think he's going to get like a massive extension or anything next summer, but at some point they got to figure out what they have in the kid, because they really haven't played him almost at all the first two seasons.
Grant, do you have to jump, or do you still have a minute for a mini? I have two questions I did not prepare either of you for.
I'm always ready for that.
Let's do it.
So we do this segment, Brian, called Garbage Time. Name is pending since Katie Nolan had a show called Garbage Time, but I need to play this. So my first question here. It can't be the Clippers or the Miami Heat, Brian. Where would be your favorite random James Harden trade destination?
Oh, boy. I mean, favorite in the sense of like, I want to see him just cause chaos there, or he would actually be a good fit there, because there are two very different answers.
It could be any, just pick a team.
Okay.
It could be any reasoning you want.
Like Toronto would just be funny. If Masai's already talking about playing selfish, then let me introduce James Harden to the mix.
Grant.
Well, since I already alienated this fan base like 15 different times, I'm still sending him to Orlando. I don't believe in any of their guards. You need a guard. It's going to create some shots so Paolo and Franz don't have to do it all. Just have them for a year. See what it's like to have a guard that can pass, dribble, and shoot consistently.
Give me the Minnesota Timberwolves. Him playing with Anthony Edwards, and then who's ever left over from that trade. I know that the Sixers probably aren't doing that without Jaden McDaniels involved, but that would just be – it could kind of be a good fit, but it would be a very compelling, potentially implosive fit too. So I love it.
That's fun.
My second one, I'll start with you here, Grant. Championship is on the line. What are you more inclined to bet on? Ben Simmons making a shot between 3 and 10 feet, or James Harden's team winning an elimination game?
I mean, we have to be really mean either way. I'm going to bet on Harden because Ben Simmons is not going to take the shot. So I don't even have a chance. So I at least want a fighting chance that he's not going to shoot it. So yeah, I have to go with the other one. What
about you, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, elimination games could also be elimination for the other team, right? Like they swept the Nets last year, so they did technically win one elimination game.
It's true.
So I will cheat and say that for that reason.
I will say, I won't answer because I know, but Ben Simmons for his career is shooting 41.6% on shots between 3 and 10 feet. And so if that's a 41.6% proposition, do you guys know James Harden's team's records in elimination games?
Probably not that high.
39.4%.
Oh, coin flip situation.
So statistically, Ben Simmons is the answer, but I thought that might bend your brains a little bit.
That does hurt. Hey, do you want to play the You'll Never Guess game? I have it queued up.
I would love to play it if you have time. And Brian, are you willing to partake?
Yeah.
Grant can explain it, and the whole point is to make you and I look like idiots, and I've looked like an idiot a couple times already with it. It's fun.
You guys can even collaborate on this. Okay. So Brian, all this is there's 3 levels to it. There's easy, medium, and hard. The answer is just an NBA player. They don't need to be active, but they'll be someone that like you 100% know who they are. It's not I'm not going to pull a name from like the 50s or anything, or even all these guys have played like within the last 10 years. Okay. And I just give clues, and they hopefully I won't need to use all of them, and you guys will be able to guess who it is. So that's it. Pretty simple, half-baked idea.
And we can just yell when either of us knows the
answer.
When
you know it, say the name.
Okay.
Like, should we pause after each clue to see if Brian and I need another clue, and then go for like we want to collaborate on this? What's the best way to do it?
Yeah. Well, you can just wait till the clue is read, and then you can answer. Although now that I'm looking at the first clue on easy, it might only take one clue for this guy. Let's see. I'm gonna reverse the order of the clues for easy because that might be too easy. All right. I was the 28th pick in the 2001 draft. My career spanned from the 01-02 season to 2018-19. Not going to get it there probably. Unless you really know the 01 draft. I've got 4 rings, 6 All-Star game appearances, and 4 All-NBA nods.
Ooh.
I was the 06-07 Finals MVP. I've averaged at least 5 assists.
I think I got it. Tony Parker?
You got it. Do you know what the first clue was that you were going to get it on? I was born in Belgium. I feel like everybody.
I wouldn't have gotten that one. No. That wouldn't have done it for me.
The next clue was going to be I've averaged at least 5 assists 13 times. Let's see. Some of these just like blew my mind. Top 10 in MVP voting 4 times. He was 5th in MVP in 11-12. Forgot about that.
Shout out Lockout.
All right, that was easy. Yeah. Oh, that's right. Okay, we move on to medium. Dan, I'm looking at you on this one, okay? Although Brian...
Stephon Marbury.
Brian back to the Marbury well.
I mean, paper mache shoes.
However, I have played for these teams in this order. The Knicks, the Warriors, the Celtics, the Mavs, and
David
the Spurs.
Lee.
God damn it.
Wow.
Good job.
Wow.
Good job. You would have gotten it by I lost my starting job in 14-15 and never got it back. All right. So now we move on to hard, although now I don't know what to think about my ordering since you got easy, you got medium and 1. All right. Redemption, Dan. Good job. All right. I am a combo guard that went to Washington, and I'm from the state of Washington for college. I was the rookie of the year and obviously made all rookie in 06-07. I made the All-Star team in my second, third, and fourth years in the league, but never again. I was all NBA in my third and fourth years.
Is it Brandon Roy?
It is Brandon Roy. I didn't even have to get to the fourth quarter against the Mavs in Game 4 that one year. Good job. Two heads are way better than one.
Yeah. Well
that
done.
Is like, I might be able to clip that eventually since it's evergreen into like a single short.
Yeah,
because the easy one took us the longest.
I mean, it's a work in progress. I don't know how hard to make the clues. But
Grant,
also, I realized I went with 3 retired guys. By the way, I didn't intentionally do that, but
there are people clamoring for nominations. I haven't checked the messages, but people have now sent me clues for us to use. So we'll have to try and get to that in the next episode you and I do. Okay. But I love this game. It makes me feel terrible about myself because I had no idea about 2 of 3 of these players. I don't know that I would have guessed them, but it's fun.
Can I just start sending you guys like process Sixer names? Like
Please.
Hollis Thompson.
Oh my, I'm telling you right now, I'm not getting Hollis Thompson. I don't know what the clue would have to be. But
you know who I'll get? If you send me KJ McDaniels clues, I'll know it.
Oh,
yeah.
I got that line is on lock.
Wasn't he like one of the first Hinkie special contracts?
Yeah, begrudgingly. He refused to sign it for a while, and that's why he got traded immediately.
So now you sign the Hinkie special when it's offered.
That's right. Yeah, well, hey, it worked out for TJ McConnell and Robert Covington. That's all I'm saying.
It's true, yeah.
Brian, are you just able, thank you so much for doing this with us. It was fun to have a third person for it. Are you able to just tell our listeners where they can find you and all the great work that you do before Grant takes us out of here?
For sure. Well, thank you guys for having me. As much as I hate talking about this godforsaken team, it's always good seeing you two. Y'all can find me on X or Twitter, or whatever you want to call it, or any social media platform at btoporek. That is BTOPOREK. You can find my written work for Sixer stuff, especially at Liberty Ballers, and Forbes Sports cover all sorts of NBA, including the Oklahoma City Thunder, for all the Thunder fans out there. And you can find the NBA podcast wherever podcasts are found.
Honestly, if the uncontested podcast folks are listening to this, I know they listen from time to time, you guys need to invite Toporek on your pod. It's time for him. It's time.
I'm ready to be baptized in the Sam Presti bathwater.
Well, Brian, again, thank you very much for your perspective and joining us here. I will tell everyone, as always, to rate, review, subscribe, follow us on all the socials. Do the same for the NBA podcast. Brian and Mort do awesome work. I listen to it regularly. If you want to find ways to follow, support, check out the links in the YouTube and podcast description here. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, buy some merch. That's also something you can do to support. And I guess we should probably close the Sixers pod with a Go Thunder.